The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Cosmetics Viral Tubing Mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Cosmetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Cosmetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Cosmetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster and it's Pride Month. It's June. This is the time when we celebrate the history and the current status of and the future of all of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. And so with that in mind, we're having another queer history episode, another trans history episode. And today, for a third time, our special guest is Kit Heyam, who has been on the show. Initially, Kit's first episode was talking about their book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender, which is such a good book. And actually, that is one of the references I used for today's episode, because one of the people profiled in Kit's book is the person we're talking about today, the public universal friend. Kit also returned when we did an episode about Elagabalus, the horny teenage trans Roman emperor, who, side note, in that episode, I forgot to ask Kit to help with scoring Elagabalus on the scandaliciousness scale. So we did record that as well. And so that episode is being re-released. If you go back, if you're going to scroll back, you can hear how we scored Elagabalus in the Scandaliciousness scale or also on the scoring. It's just its own special episode on Patreon as well. But anyway, a third time. And I was thinking in the episode, I said it's a record-breaking third time. And I think it is. So in terms of guests on this show, Miss Hepburn is here. I mean, she's the most frequent guest star on the podcast. That is my cat, who you may hear purring directly next to the microphone right now. But also, so friend of the podcast, Gina Barry, has been on twice, although we have recorded a third episode. It's just, you haven't heard it yet. So Kit is the first 3-time returning guest. Now, some of the other people who've been on the podcast before, Allison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson, I consider honorary co-hosts rather than guests of the podcast. Anyway, Kit, every time I encounter something in trans history, I'm just like, I wonder if Kit's written about this. Like, I wonder if Kit can come on the podcast, because I just love talking with them. That's why I keep having them back on the show. And Public Universal Friend, I think, is such a fascinating person. And I'm so glad that Kit joined us to talk us through this story of American history. You know, Kit as a British person, me as a Canadian person, we're both kind of objective outsiders to the world of American history. But Public Universal Friend, quite a saga as we get into it. Some similarities to the story of Elagabalus, just in terms of sort of like an audacious person from trans history whose spirituality is a very important part of their life. Anyway, I do want to mention that other than Kit's book, Before We Were Trans, the other major reference that I was looking at for this episode was an essay from the encyclopedia Women in World History, which is written by Amanda Carson Banks in 2002. Anyway, happy Pride. Let's talk about the Public Universal Friend. So I'm joined by Kit Heyam. Welcome, Kit.
Hi, thank you for having me.
This is a record-breaking third appearance on this podcast because I can't not have you on.
It's a total delight to be here. Is that genuinely a record? Am I like a recurring guest type record?
You are now officially a recurring guest. There's only a few people who've been on 3 times. I think
that's an honor.
2 people, and you're the second. So, but yeah, and I want to let the listeners know as well. And you, I guess, too. So I've been doing this podcast now for 4 years, and people have heard me do episodes about queer history and about trans history, and I've been learning both of those things, more about them on air with guests like you, as people listen to me. So just so people know, when I encounter a story where I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I think this is a bit of trans history, I'm always like, Kit, what do you think about this person? Have you studied this person? Like I messaged you when I did the Het Shepset episode recently, just to clarify, like, how do I talk about this? So I appreciate you being behind the scenes, kind of my go-to expert.
Oh, no, anytime. Like, it's really great to be able to talk about, as we were saying off air, the complicated figures from trans history, the people who aren't just like our inspiring ancestors, but are actually bonkers in various ways.
Exactly. And so for people who perhaps haven't heard your previous episodes with me, where we've talked about this, but I do want to just clarify it again. Can you explain the way you do in your book and that you have on other episodes, trans history in general? It's not just the history of people who make one transition and stick with it. It's very expansive.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really important that we distinguish between trans people in history, which is basically people who've said that they were trans using that terminology, because obviously terminology and the way we think about gender changes so much between times and cultures. So distinguishing between trans people in history and trans history, which is the history that shows us that gender has never been something that's tied to the body, has never been something that's fixed or stable. And when we look at it that way, we find that there is so much history that shows us the messiness and the complexness of gender. And I think that this story that we're talking about today is a really, really good example of that. It might not be a trans person in history, but it's absolutely trans history in the way that it shows us that gender has always been something we can mess with.
This is such a fascinating one too. I mean, I'm not going to keep teasing everybody. We're going to get into the story, but first, like, how do you suggest? And I mean, 100 people could suggest 100 different ways to approach this, but like this story, like I'm assuming they, them pronouns, because that's they specifically did that in their life after a certain point.
Yeah, I'm going to use they, them pronouns to talk about this person. It might be that it would probably be also appropriate to use she, her for the point before they transformed. And I use the word transformed really advisedly, because the narrative, the way this person understands themselves is having been a woman who then died and was reborn as a genderless spirit in a human body. So maybe we go from she, her to they, them, but they, them would also be an appropriate way to capture all of that massive complexity.
Well, and that's also where I was thinking about, because there's the whole thing about like, do you use, like dead names and stuff? And I'm like, well, this person was this person and then became a new person very consciously. So it's not like they said, I was never Jemima. It's like, no, I was. And then I stopped it. So it's complicated.
Yeah, and arguably dead name is a really appropriate term to use for this, because we're talking about someone who literally identifies as dying and then coming back to life as a different gender.
And then also, okay, so we're going to talk about the situation. So that's what I'll do. I'll start. So Jemima Wilkinson was born November 29th, 1752 in Cumberland, Rhode Island. So this is exactly the time period all the episodes are so far this series. We're talking about people who were born in the 18th century, pre-American Revolution, pre all the revolutions, but already the world is just from like the slave trade and other trade, like there's so much international stuff going on. People are moving from country to country. So it's already sort of a world that's kind of in flux is what she is born into. So this is another ongoing recurring thing in this series is massive families. So Jemima is the 8th of 12 children of Amy Whipple and Jeremiah Wilkinson. And they were actually the 4th generation of the family to live in America, which is interesting because I think of like, oh, America's still a pretty new country, but 4 generations in. So they've been there a while. So just some notable connections. So their great-grandfather had been in the army of Charles I, emigrating around 1650. And then father was a cousin of Stephen Hopkins, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, which doesn't necessarily mean this is like, wow, look at these connections. It just means it was a small world and a lot of people signed the Declaration of Independence. So the mom died when Jemima was around 12 years old, giving birth to the 12th child. Another recurring motif in this series, Kit, is just people, these women having so many children and then inevitably dying, giving birth to one of them. It's just like, oh.
Yeah, just imagine being pregnant for that much of your life and then dying in childbirth. Is having been pregnant once, I plan to never do that again, no matter, like, never mind 12 times. That's ridiculous.
It's women who they spent their entire adult married life just being pregnant and breastfeeding and being pregnant and breastfeeding. So this is a Quaker family. You know about Quakerism. Is that an expected thing in Quakerism? Or do you know, historically, was it to just have like be fruitful and multiply and like just have lots of kids? Was that a thing?
It's probably just more of a kind of settler colonial thing at this time than it is primarily a Quaker thing. So yeah, I grew up in a loosely Quaker family, was raised a Quaker until my family left our local meeting house for not particularly religious reasons, just like interpersonal ones. But it's not a religion that's big on be fruitful and multiply. It's much more about, it's kind of, I mean, I like to think of it as one of the most kind of humane branches of mainstream Christianity, in that there's a big emphasis on God's light being in everybody, on the validity of other religions. They say the lamps are different, but the lights are the same, which is really nice. And on pacifism, which I know is something we're going to come on to. And so I think what's really going on with those 12 kids is the settler colonial context in North America and the desire to really populate that land and outcompete the Native Americans. I think that's what Amy is kind of being pressured towards from that angle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's certainly something that we see a lot in most colonial settler societies. It's just like we need to have as many white children as possible just to have more population. So the Society of Friends, is that AKA Quaker? Are those interchangeable? Or do you know?
Exactly. Yeah, they call themselves the Society of Friends. Other people call them Quakers. They kind of reclaim that label later on. But initially, yeah, they're the Society of Friends to themselves.
And so the Quaker, I didn't warn you I was going to be diving into Quakerism with you, but I was like, oh, I'm bringing this up just because I saw in your book that you were raised Quaker. So were they religiously persecuted in England? Is that part of why they came to America?
Yes, absolutely. So there was a big exodus of nonconformist religion to America from England. There was, yes, essentially nonconformist religion was really cracked down on, particularly following the restoration of Charles II. I can read you some facts that I've just looked up now, and you can edit out me umming and ahhing about it.
Yeah, we'll take out everything. I'll be like, tell me about this, and you can just say some facts. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Quaker Act 1662 was an act explicitly aimed at persecuting the Quakers. And there was very little tolerance of what was called nonconformist religion in England in that period. And so there was an exodus of anyone who wasn't a kind of mainstream Protestant during the mid to late 17th century, which I know is when the Wilkinson family come over.
So that's sort of like, I've been learning, I've never read up on the American Revolution before I started doing this series, but now I understand the northern colonies were founded by religious refugees, and the southern American colonies were kind of like plantation business people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a really important cultural distinction, partly in the way that they understand themselves and partly in the way they understand sort of the point of the USA, or the point of the colonies that they're establishing. Are they primarily to exploit the land, to work the land, and to exploit the enslaved people and make as much kind of money and productivity as possible? Or are they to found a society that's more religiously pure and more religiously exemplary than England that they left behind was? And so the northern colonies have that idea of, we need to be the religious exemplars that we want to see in the world and that we want everyone else to follow. And that's where a lot of that conflict comes from, really, is those different kind of concepts and understandings of what they think that country is even for.
Yeah, and that was something I didn't realize till I started reading about this, was that whole North and South thing that I hear about more in the context of the American Civil War. Started early. It was just kind of like there was already the North and the South were settled completely differently. So mid-1770s. So Jemima Wilkinson is in her early 20s and switched. There's a lot of leaving of the group by various people. So Jemima left the Society of Friends, aka the Quakers, to attend meetings with the New Light Baptists, which is another group. And so the Society of Friends disowned them because of this, which, I mean, fair. Like, you left the group, so...
You kind of disowned them first, yeah.
Yeah. You can't fire me, I quit. So at around the same time, Jemima's sister Patience was dismissed from the Society of Friends as well for having an illegitimate child. And because remember, there's 12 siblings. And so at this point, 4 of the siblings have all been dismissed. 2 of the brothers are dismissed because they went off to train for military service. And this is around the time that the American Revolution was kicking off and lots of people were signing up for military service. So I would presume for a family where religion was so important that the roots of the family had fled persecution to come here to found this colony, to have 4 children disowned from the Society of Friends is probably very traumatic, very stressful for everybody.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And I mean, thinking about the chronology, it seems actually like the original emigrants from the Wilkinson family were not necessarily Quakers, because they emigrated before Quakerism was founded. So they'll have converted on American soil, which will have made them actually probably even more steeped in that community, because that's the only community they've got. They haven't got anyone else. They've only got the people around them. So I think that, yeah, that instability from having 4 of your children disowned from what is your main community in this new country is going to have been really real, I think.
Yeah. So, and I would imagine that it was probably a very serious decision when Jemima decided to switch from Society of Friends to the New Light Baptists, and probably a lot was going on. And then typhus. There's so many diseases that were around. Jemima is stricken with typhus during an epidemic, was bedridden, and near death, asterisk, potentially actually died. So her fever broke after a few days, and the way that this is where Jemima, can you talk us through Jemima's transformation?
So this is where Jemima dies in 1776. This is the narrative that we have from Jemima and, well, should I say actually, from the person that they became, or the spirit that they became, and their followers. So Jemima dies from typhus, and their body arises from its deathbed, no longer Jemima, but instead the spirit of God in what they call a tabernacle of flesh. And they choose the name, not Jemima, but the Public Universal Friend, which is a name they take from the sect, from the tradition of traveling Quaker preachers who are known as public friends. The Public Universal Friend is a public friend who is universal, who can speak to everybody, and who, very crucially, is genderless. So this is the point at which Jemima, she, her pronouns, dies. The Public Universal Friend, genderless, they, them pronouns, arises from the deathbed. They say it's a new name which the mouth of the Lord hath named. So this is where we get the gender transformation. This is where this becomes trans history in a really, really interesting way.
Yeah. So I like this. At one point, someone asked, well, the friend is how you refer to them in your book. So that's how, I guess, Public Universal Friend is cumbersome to say every time. Someone asked the friend, like, are you male or are you female? And the friend replied, I am that I am.
I mean, you can't argue with that.
Yeah. So exactly. So this is the term, like there's other stories in trans history where we now are just be like, okay, like, how did this person see themselves? We don't really know. But here they were very clear, being like, I am not male. I am not female. I am Public Universal Friend. Like, genderless is how they describe themselves.
Yeah, and there's so much evidence. Again, like you say, with a lot of trans history, we're reading between the lines. We're looking at accounts of how other people saw them or might have seen them, or they might have seen themselves. Here, we've not only got first-hand testimony, we've got all their followers, and we've got all the people who came to see them preach, because they became a bit of a religious celebrity. And all of these people saying, oh yeah, this person, they're not a man or a woman, and this is how they dress. And we get a really kind of detailed picture, much more so than we do in a lot of trans history, like you say.
Yeah, exactly. To me, a relief, because I don't have to, I'm just like, how do I talk about this? Kit, tell me what to do. But here's just like, no, Public Universal Friend is like, here's what's going on. Jemima is dead. The Spirit of God is in me. So right away, the way that this was described is, they refused to answer to Jemima Wilkinson, ignoring or chastising those who insisted on using that name. The friend asked not to be referred to with gendered pronouns, and followers, because they did have a following and that increased, they referred only to the Public Universal Friend, or sometimes the friend, or sometimes PUF, which is what I started calling them in my notes just to save time. So I'm just like, Puff, the Public Universal Friend. And the followers avoided gender-specific pronouns even in their private diaries, which speaks to how deeply they respected and believed how this person wanted to be referred to. And this is just like, I want to pause to just be like, anyone today who's like, oh, pronouns, blah, blah, blah. It's like 1776. Like, and earlier, people were doing this.
Yeah, and people were fine with it. And it was compatible with religion, which is a thing worth emphasizing, I think.
Absolutely, with Christian religion. That, exactly. So just listeners, note that. And so the friend dressed, and this is a time period in which there was a very clear distinction between male dress and female dress. And the friend dressed in a manner perceived to be androgynous or masculine. So in long, loose clerical robes, which I don't know if that's, I'm just picturing the man on the Quaker oats. I don't know if he's wearing a robe.
I mean, to be fair, pretty much, actually. That's pretty on it.
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. So it's like, this is androgynous or masculine. So wearing a long, loose clerical robe. So the friend is not wearing trousers. The way that a Quaker preacher would dress was already kind of androgynous in a loose robe. And that is what they wore, with a white or purple kerchief or cravat around the neck, which is like the Quaker Oats man, which is a male presenting thing. Did not wear a hair cap indoors. So women of the era would wear a cap on their head. The Friend did not do that. Outdoors wore a broad-brimmed, low-crowned beaver hat in the Quaker male style. So, beginning in 1776, the Friend gathered a group of around 20 of their most devoted followers, which is, just pause, because it was 1776, Jemima died of typhus. Public Universal Friend was born, and that same year, there was already at least 20 followers. Like, the followers are right there. And they traveled a circuit around Rhode Island and Connecticut preaching their message. And I like this detail, so they would process through. So the Friend would be wearing their flowing long robe, followers riding 2 by 2 behind them on horses. And they were originally well received in these churches. So this is between 1777 and 1782. They traveled around and people were like, yeah, this message, we like it. I assume the message is, I don't know, what do you know about what the message was? Just kind of like, everyone be nice to each other. I don't know.
The message is mostly just basic Quakerism. It's kind of regurgitated bits of the Bible. A lot of the people who went to see the Friend preach sort of write back, actually, this isn't anything particularly radical or interesting. I mean, it's good. Like, a lot of it is around kind of anti-slavery messaging. And there is, maybe we'll talk about this later, there is quite a feminist strand in the beliefs that they had as well. But there's nothing like wildly different from what you could hear from any other Quaker preacher. I think a lot of people came to see them to see this amazing reborn genderless person, perhaps more than to actually hear anything particularly interesting they had to say.
Well, and just what you mentioned about, like, I just want to highlight the pacifism side of things. So by now, like, it's 1777 to 1782. That's the period of the American Revolution almost exactly. So while the American Revolution is happening, Public Universal Friend is just like going around just being like, be cool to each other, like Bill and Ted sort of message. But also because Quakerism is incompatible with war, like Quakers weren't allowed to fight in the war. That's why their brothers were disavowed for doing military training. So you're not allowed to participate in wars when you're Quaker. And then also it's anti-slavery. So because every person has the light of God within them, so you shouldn't treat people in this way.
Yeah, that is a really important kind of aspect of Quaker theology from the very beginning. And that's one of the reasons that it is such a threat to the English state. That's one of the reasons why the initial persecution in England, where it emerges, happens, because it's an incredibly non-hierarchical religion. If you've ever been in a Quaker meeting, you'll know that anyone can stand up and say, the Spirit of God has prompted me to say something. It's not something where everyone has to sit down and shut up and listen to a particular person, although that's the main kind of mode that the Public Universal Friend was preaching in. Meetings are very, very non-hierarchical. And so that extends, as you say, to valuing everybody equally, including enslaved people. The flip side of this, of course, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit more later on too, is that the Friend was also really invested in forming their own community, and that requires land. That requires agitating for large amounts of land. And so there's this kind of incoherent ideology around this anti-slavery message, but this perfect willingness to persist with settler colonialism and to not perhaps see Native American people as having quite the same humanity as the enslaved people they were agitating for the freedom of.
Yeah, it's complex. It's on the podcast last week, the listeners would have heard when we were talking about Deborah Sampson / Robert Shurtleff, who we were looking at in the context of trans history as well, and also settler colonialism. Like, in order to succeed as a soldier, to be accepted as masculine, there's a famous story about them killing for truly no reason, just to kind of like look cool, just murdering this indigenous man. So it's like that angle of things, I think, is really important to always mention in these stories. The American Indian people are often just kind of invisible in these contexts. But I do want to say about the Quakers in general, because we do have some more episodes coming up about, actually starting next week, listeners, about some slave narratives. And I do talk about the Quakers and how they were really pushing for abolition. And that's part of why it kind of started around Pennsylvania and places where there's a lot of Quakers. So the Friend is traveling and preaching through Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, accompanied by several of their siblings. So their sister Patience, the one who had been kicked out for having the child out of wedlock, was there supporting the Friend, along as 3 other sisters, one of the brothers. So basically all of the Wilkinsons that had been disavowed by the Society of Friends were now traveling with the Friend, which is nice, that they have that community. Okay. So this is where, and I don't know what the distinction is between a religious sect and, let's say, a cult. But there are some cult vibes.
Marketing, I would say.
Fair. Because the Friend starts to predict the fulfillment of some of the Book of Revelation, claiming that around April 1780, 42 months after they began preaching, like, the world would end, which is a real cult thing that people still do, giving a specific day. I forget what happened that day. There was like a solar eclipse or something, and the Friend was like, that was it. I guess that's what I was thinking of. Not the end of days, just a solar eclipse. The same with the people now are like, the world's going to end on this day. And when that day comes and goes, they're like, you all prayed so well. I guess it didn't happen. Good job. I wasn't wrong. It's just, anyway. Okay, so the Friend did not bring a Bible to worship meetings, which are initially held outdoors or in borrowed meeting houses, but instead preach long sections of the scriptures from memory. In Quaker, what are they called? Meetings? They're not services. Yeah. Meetings. Is there usually Bible readings, or is it people quoting from memory?
These days, it's and initially too, it's mostly silent worship. So you sit in silence, and then anyone who feels the need to speak or feels the kind of spirit move within them can speak. But that speech certainly today may or may not have anything at all to do with the Bible. A lot of the time, these days, if you were to go to a meeting, it would be more likely to find a kind of reflection on social justice in many cases than it would be sections from the Bible, though clearly, this is a different historical context. But yeah, that's one of the things that is interesting about the kind of cult celebrity of the Friend, I think, is that in its focus on one individual, it's not really all that Quaker.
Yeah, it reminds me, and most of my context for understanding the New Testament Bible is the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. But I'm like, this is so much like Jesus Christ Superstar. By which I mean, I guess, the Bible. But it's just this very charismatic person, and just people are following them place to place, and they're preaching. Like, it feels like that seems to be the model that they're going after, like a kind of Jesus figure. Being, dying and coming back to life. Like, it just seems kind of like they're doing a whole Jesus thing.
You can see why people accuse them of pretending to be Jesus, right? Which they did deny, as you know. But
yeah.
You can see where that came from. It's not really a particularly big leap to be like, does this person think they're actually Jesus?
Yeah, because it's a big Jesus cosplay. And so the meetings attracted large audiences, some of whom formed a congregation of universal friends, making the Friend the first American to found a religious community. So later on, when we're talking about significance in the scoring, that's significant. The followers were roughly like men and also women, mostly people under age 40. Most are from Quaker backgrounds, though mainstream Quakers discouraged and disciplined members for attending meetings with the Friend. Who had long ago, well, I guess Jemima was disowned. And now the Friend, I don't know if the Friend had to be separately disowned, because it's like, I'm a different person now. But my notes say the Society of Friends disowned the friend. So just to make sure, if they were like, oh no, Jemima was disowned, but I'm not Jemima anymore. You're also disowned, the friend. So there were also, at this point, the American Revolution has ended. And so there's these people who had been soldiers who had been disowned for joining up to fight in the War of Independence, were now still just not allowed to go back. It seems like a real shunning sort of thing. Like once you're disowned, like that's it. You can't get back in. So these people were sympathetic and they opened meeting houses to Universal Friends, like these soldiers who were still probably would have wanted to still be Quakers, but couldn't be. And so popular newspapers and pamphlets covered the Friends' sermons in detail, with several Philadelphia newspapers being particularly critical. So in terms of celebrity, I found this interesting. Like part of what we know about them and what they did is because they were having huge meetings, they're being covered by the press. People who attended the meetings would write letters about them. Like they were a big deal.
Yeah, they were. And I think, like I said, perhaps more because of their kind of unconventional dress and people wanting to see this genderless being than because of anything they were actually doing theologically. You could get the stuff they were doing theologically in many other places, but you couldn't get seeing someone who came back to life as someone with no gender. That was what was kind of unique. And not all the attention was positive, obviously. There were mobs in Philadelphia that attacked them with brickbats. So it's not a case of necessarily adoring crowds. It's more fascinated and kind of rowdy crowds a lot of the time.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't know. It's not like a Taylor Swift moment where everybody who comes to see them is a huge fan and loves everything they do. Like some people are going just to boo them, probably. Yeah, noisy crowds gathered outside each place they stayed or spoke in 1788, apparently, but that didn't stop them. So, we don't know. Actually, no. I was going to say we don't know why they're doing this, but we do because they were constantly saying who they were and what they were doing. Like they wanted to spread this message, and that's what was driving them on, or so they said, was they wanted people to hear this message, which, as you said, is just basically Quakerism. But yeah, as you said, the coverage of them focused more on the preacher's ambiguous gender than on theology, because, again, their message was not any different from what other Quakers are doing. Oh yeah, so the Friends' theology was so similar to that of mainstream Quakers that one of two published works associated with them, like they published two works. One of them was plagiarism of someone else. Isaac Pennington wrote a book just called Works. And then Public Universal Friend republished it saying like Works by Public Universal Friend. Because they felt that people would like it. They would take the message better if they thought that the Public Friend had said it.
Or that it would at least have more reach because everyone had heard of the Vulgar Universal Friend. Yeah, that's not really cool, is it?
No. There's a certain, there's, like you said, the difference between a cult and a religion is often marketing. And I feel like the difference between, a preacher and a grifter might be similar. So let's see. So this is some more stuff about their concept. So they rejected the ideas of predestination and election. This is the kind of feminist stuff, held that anyone, regardless of gender, could gain access to God's light. God spoke directly to individuals who had free will to choose how to act and believed in the possibility of universal salvation. So I think there's a bit later on more about feminism and women and stuff, but I think that's part of what's appealing about this message too, because I had said like the people who followed them, it was about like half men, half women, generally. Like it resonated with different sorts of people. I mean, it sounds like, again, like a very positive, hopeful message. Like it's not telling everybody like, I was raised Catholic. So it's not telling everybody, it's like, you're all sinners, repent constantly. This is all just like, God speaks to people. We're all children of God. I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of nice.
And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. but at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the Roaring '20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
This episode is brought to you by Heineken Silver. When you discover something you love, like a new podcast or beer, you have to tell everyone about it. So when you try new Heineken Silver, a world-class light beer with only 2.9 carbs and 95 calories, you'll want to tell the world how great it is. New Heineken Silver, the world-class light beer with all the taste, no bitter endings. Available at your local Heineken retailer or for delivery at heineken.com/silver. Must be 21 plus to purchase. Enjoy Heineken responsibly.
Get softer, smoother, and more even-toned skin after just one use with the new Gentle Exfoliating line from Cetaphil. Formulated with a unique triple acid blend that promotes surface skin cell renewal, these gentle chemical exfoliators remove dead skin cells and refine skin's texture while hydrating, resulting in softer, smoother, more even-looking skin. Shop the new Cetaphil Gentle Exfoliating line in the face and body aisles at your local Target store or online at Cetaphil.com.
And we're back. So the Friend was, like other Quakers, called for the abolition of slavery, persuaded followers who were enslavers to free the enslaved people. Several members of the congregation were Black, and they acted as witnesses for manumission papers. So I think that's the papers that were freeing some people from bondage. This whole section, I'm getting this all from this reference, thank God, that they have the public library, Women in World History. I'm always excited when somebody I'm researching has one of these essays because they're all really well researched by academics. But this is where they're just kind of getting into the Friend preached humility and hospitality towards everyone, kept religious meetings open to the public, housed and fed visitors, including those who came only out of curiosity, and indigenous people, which is a strange way to phrase that. The preacher generally had a cordial relationship with indigenous people. And they had few personal possessions, mostly given by followers, and never held any real property except in trust. And then we get into, so the Friend preached sexual abstinence and disfavored marriage, but did not see celibacy as mandatory and accepted marriage as preferable to breaking abstinence outside of wedlock. What's that? Do Quakers think that, or is this like we're getting some of the Friends' personal ideas?
This is an early Quaker thing. It's not so much a Quaker thing now because obviously things have evolved. But yeah, it is an early Quaker thing, and I guess it's part of the emphasis on kind of plain dress and abstinence from things like alcohol and tobacco, which again were kind of early Quaker preoccupations. It's part of the abstinence from pleasures of the body. But I think, this is, if we're thinking about situations in which women could be liberated as a result of the Friends preaching, this is one of them, right? If you don't marry and you don't have sex, you're not going to be pregnant for your entire adult life and then die giving birth to your 12th child, right? That's actually quite an opportunity for lots of people.
Yeah. So speaking of women, so the preacher, the friend, also said women should obey God rather than men.
Mm-hmm.
And the most committed followers included roughly 4 dozen unmarried women known as the Faithful Sisterhood, who took on leading roles of the sort that were often reserved for men. The portion of households headed by women in the society, so what is it? Like, there's the friend and their followers are considered a society.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Society of Universal Friends is the name of their followers.
Different from the Society of Friends, which is aka
which
Quakers.
is just the Quakers. Yeah.
Right. So the portion of households held by women in the society settlements was 20%, and that's much higher than in surrounding areas. So this is what you mentioned earlier, like kind of the feminist angle, like women. This is a difference between general Quakerism and what the friend was preaching. There's more opportunities for women, right?
Yeah, exactly. Particularly that idea that women should obey God rather than men. That hasn't really, at this time, made it into kind of mainstream Quakerism, despite their emphasis on non-hierarchical worship. And yeah, as I said, particularly that opportunity to embrace not marrying is something that is a great way out of kind of compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory pregnancy for women who want that at the time.
Yeah, there's going to be, like, again, I'm doing this whole series about kind of people in the 18th century, and there are several instances of women who got married because that was kind of the only thing you could do. And then when the husband dies, leaving you with debt, like, you're fucked. Like, there's nothing you can do because you're a woman and maybe you have all these children and you can't own property. So what the friend was offering, I can see where that would appeal to people who wanted something other. So due to the rising antagonism, you were talking about, the crowds. What did you say? Attack them with bats or?
Yeah, stones and brickbats in Philadelphia. There's a real religious objection to the idea that the friend is setting themselves up as a kind of religious exemplar, and particularly, as we mentioned, those comparisons with Jesus. This person coming around with a band of followers saying, "I was resurrected." That's a little concerning to a lot of Christians at the time.
Well, and considering too, in these areas like Rhode Island and Connecticut, like these are the areas that were founded by people fleeing religious persecution in England. So these are people, whatever, fourth generation people, religion is so important to them. Like, they take it so seriously and so literally that this would be seen as really a threat. And so 1783, they transferred the headquarters to Philadelphia, which is where their only published work that they actually wrote appeared. The Universal Friends' advice to those of the same religious society recommended to be read in their public meetings. However, Philadelphia was only slightly less intolerant, and so in 1785, they returned to New England and then met Sarah and Abraham Richards. So they had an unhappy marriage. Sarah met the Society of Friends as a widow, and then with the infant daughter took up residence with the friend. And Sarah also adopted the same look, the same androgynous robes look, apparently the same dress and mannerisms as did a few other close female friends, and came to be called Sarah Friend. So this is another where you're like cult or religion, like the fact that the followers started dressing like, using the same mannerisms, which you see in fandoms, I guess. If someone's, again, a fan of Taylor Swift, not that I'm calling that a cult, but people would, Swifties, like, they quote her a lot. I think they would do the same dances as her. It's like you maybe cut your hair like her, you dress like her because that's who you idolize. But here, them dressing like the friend and adopting the mannerisms it's a little culty to me, is how it sounds. But Sarah Friend became a high-up person in this group. They were entrusted with holding the society's property in trust and was sent to be sort of a backup preacher in one part of the country when the friend was in another. And maybe that's maybe that's why you want kind of doppelgangers. So you can have lookalikes, so you can do more speaking engagements. I don't know.
It's a good strategy. I could do with some of them.
So Sarah Friend had a large part in planning and building the house in which she and the friend lived in the town of Jerusalem. And when she died in 1793, left her child to the friend's care. So Sarah Friend, an example of followers. So there's a lot of detail in here we don't necessarily need to get to, but the Friend was meeting with some influential people of the time. So we're in 1794. It's like post American Revolution. Like that ended 10 years ago. But there's still people are trying to figure out, what is this new American country going to be like? How is it going to work with like the indigenous people and the colonists and like inventing this new country, and how is it going to be? So the Iroquois were involved in producing this treaty, and the Friend gave a speech to U.S. government officials and Iroquois chiefs about the importance of peace and love, which the Iroquois liked. So I don't know. Bringing the public universal friend, I don't know how. I think I don't want to say that the other people writing these treaties were more suitable for doing that, because these treaties were all terrible and shitty. But I also think the public universal friend is a wild person to involve in these sorts of discussions, because I don't see them as having really both feet in reality.
Yeah, they have zero expertise in actually negotiating humane treaties. I don't know what's going on there.
For some reason. But part of this was, when I was looking through this, I was trying to get this whole series and finding connections between all the people, like sometimes unexpected connections between people who you wouldn't think can connect back to each other. So this is where the Friend is involved with some of the great thinkers of the time, just because I think they were just a celebrity, the same way that, here, like the White House might invite some poets or something. It's like, well, you're just kind of a notable person of the time. So 1788, they decided to try a different climate for preaching and purchased a large parcel of land in Yates County near Seneca Lake in western New York State. Within 2 years, it was ready enough that the rest of the Universal Friends set out to join it, making it the largest non-native community in western New York. One might say, like a cult might do.
Well, do you know, when you said cult earlier, I was like, this is the cultiest thing they do, is create their own like cult compound.
Yes, this is the part where I'm just like, I can't see how this is not a cult. Okay, but then there's drama about land purchasing, because I think partially because the public universal friend is not concerned with like the laws of society, and this is kind of like, here's what I want to do.
They're not a human, right? They're a spirit in a human body. Laws aren't for those.
Paperwork, that's not a thing for spirits to do. So anyway, I'm not going to get into all these details, but the town became known as the Friends Settlement. There's a whole issue about kind of like who owns this land, who is going to pay for this land, a whole thing about financiers. More and more settlers kept coming, and that drove prices higher. It was sort of like a bit of a fire festival situation, if you know what that is. Just kind of like people were coming and there was not the infrastructure there to support a community. Because of course not, because Public Universal Friend isn't like creating the infrastructure to have an actual functioning society. They're just like vibing with God messages. It's just like, yeah, but where are we going to, what's the water source, friend? Like,
do you know anything about plumbing, friend? Can you build houses? Yeah, no.
Yeah, so it didn't. But there's other people in the group, and maybe they have some skills. So at one point, one person acquired a large area of land in Canada. Sarah Friend is still on the scene. So she persuaded the Friend not to move to Canada. So I was like, ooh, is this going to be Canadian content? No. Anyways, they were just trying to find other places to build their place. Eventually, so the new town that they settled in was along a creek that emptied into the Crooked Lake, Cayuga Lake. The new town, which the Universal Friends began there, came to be called Jerusalem, which is really the name of the towns that a lot of Christians found in various places to be like, that's just what, there's so many places in America called Salem and things, because it's just like religious people see this as kind of like, it's like Jerusalem. Anyway, so this enterprise did better. I guess there were some helpful people with actual skills. Prospered in agriculture and lumbering. By 1800, had increased to about 260 members. But as it prospered, there's issues about like, well, where's this money going? And again, the Friend is not a financier. The Friend is just really not concerned with worldly matters. Apparently, the Friend developed a penchant for requesting gifts and personal effects from members by saying, "The friend hath need of these things."
This is what celebrity does to you, I guess.
Yeah. And then assigned degrading forms of punishment for various infractions of the society rules. So, because earlier it had said that the friend had very few personal possessions and stuff. It's like, yeah, but they had all these things that were other people's possessions that they came to possess. So people were becoming disillusioned, not everybody, but some people. So in the fall of 1799, some followers led several attempts to arrest the friend for blasphemy, which was probably more to do with disagreements over land ownership and power. And this it's a familiar situation, I think, where people have all of the best intentions in the world, or spiritual intentions or something. But once you get a bunch of people having to live day to day, like, you're going to get into some fights and some hurt feelings and things. You can't just be like, everyone love each other, like this kind of hippie commune. Eventually, that's not going to work. An officer tried to seize the friend while out riding on the horse, but the friend, a skilled horse rider, escaped. I like that moment. That's in a movie, that'll be a big scene.
Oh, yeah.
Not to mention, an officer and assistant later tried to arrest the friend at home, but the women of the house drove the men off and tore their clothes. Another exciting sequence in the film. A third attempt was carefully planned by a posse of 30 men who surrounded the home after midnight, broke the door down with an axe, and intended to carry the friend off in an ox cart. But a doctor who had come with the posse found that the friend was in too poor a state of health to be moved. So, okay. They made a deal that the friend would appear before this is Ontario, America, county court in June 1800. Anyway, eventually the friend appeared before the court. It ruled that no indictable offense had been committed. And the judge, in fact, invited the preacher to give a sermon to those in attendance. So, it said like there's some details in here you hadn't encountered before. And I just kind of knew the vague outline that this person existed, but I didn't realize that there was all this drama.
Yeah, I knew about the mobs in Philadelphia. I didn't know about the repeated attempts to actually enter their cult compound / society and actually seize them. This detail was new to me, and it's really striking the amount of planning and the amount of anger and motivation that really has to go into that. That's not just opportunistic, oh, this person's down the road, let's go and throw some stones because it'll be fun. That's really people sitting and plotting and thinking, we need to get rid of this person, and 30 of us are going to turn it with pitchforks. That's quite a lot.
But then I love the turn that found not guilty, and the judge is like, and please, I would love to hear you give one of your sermons. Like, so there's just as many fans as there are enemies, it seems like, still. So, having set aside 12,000 acres of the colony's property, which again, like, to go back to something we talked at the very beginning, is just like, these are white people, quote unquote, buying land that belongs to the indigenous people of the area. Like, this is not just an open field that no one's ever lived on before. So as much as the friend is like, everybody has their special light and spirit inside of them and all humans are special, it's kind of like, yeah, but also 12,000 acres of this are going to be turned into my personal use now. So they had an estate built on the furthest corner of the property and remained there in, quote, luxury. I'm not sure how luxurious anyone's life was in colonial America, although ailing with dropsy. And so that's probably the same illness where they were in too poor a state to be put in the ox cart by the mob earlier. And that's dropsy. I've come across it a lot. I think it basically just means kind of like a swelling. I think it's like heart problems, fluid retention, things like that. So their health had been declining for quite a while. By 1816, they began to suffer from a painful edema, but continued to receive visitors and give sermons. And this is similar to a while ago, I was doing John Knox. I did a special episode about John Knox on my Patreon. And he had a similar end where he was so ill, but he was so committed to preaching that he would have people come into his room and he would be in bed and he would give his sermons. And I feel like that's kind of what the friend is up to here. Just being like, I can't stop preaching, but the sermons will have to be in their bedroom and they'll be like lying in bed. So the friend gave a final regular sermon in November 1818 and then preached for the last time at the funeral of the sister, the one who had the child out of wedlock, Patience Wilkinson Potter, in April 1819. The friend died July 1st, which is interesting because July 4th is a very important date to Americans. July 1st, 1819. The congregation's death book records 25 minutes past 2 on the clock, the friend went from here. So in accordance with the friend's wishes, only a regular meeting and no funeral service was held afterwards, which is interesting considering how much of a celebrity cult leader they were in their life. They didn't want any celebration afterwards.
Suppose they derive part of their celebrity from like the claim that they're doing really plain living. So they've got a reputation to uphold.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. The body was placed in a coffin with a glass window set on top. So I guess people could like view the body for a while. Interred 4 days after death in a stone vault in the cellar of the friend's house. Several years later, the coffin was removed and buried in an unmarked grave in accordance with the friend's preference. Obituaries appeared in papers throughout the eastern United States because this was a famous person. So people just wanted to hear the news that they had died. Close followers remained faithful, but kind of as the original followers died, like the congregation's numbers dwindled. It was a cult of personality, if not a cult. Like it was very much based on people following this charismatic person. But unlike Jesus, this did not continue through past generations. The Society of Universal Friends disappeared by the late 1860s. The Friends' home and temporary burial chamber stands in the town of Jerusalem, and it is included on the National Register of Historic Places. The Yates County Genealogical and Historical Society's museum in Penyan, that might be a typo somewhere, exhibit the Friends' portrait, Bible, carriage, hat, saddle, and documents from the Society of Universal Friends. As late as the 1900s, inhabitants of Little Rest, Rhode Island called a species of solidago Jemima weed because its appearance in the town coincided with the preacher's first visit to the area in the 1770s. So they don't call it friend weed or PUF weed.
Yeah, I don't think they'd have been too pleased with it being called Jemima weed. Like, that's the whole thing I'm trying to say, not Jemima.
No, exactly. I picture them coming in and just like uprooting all the plants, just be like, oh no, I'm not Jemima. This plant's not Jemima. So, and then this is where I think you can explain some of this. The way that they have been presented by historians through following their life, how the story has been interpreted. Like the public universal friend very clearly was like, I am no gender. I am the public universal friend. That is who I am. But then the story has been reinterpreted.
Yeah, the friend has kind of fallen victim to a real classic of the way that trans history is kind of flattened and erased when it involves people assigned female at birth, which is the kind of desire to find inspiring and pioneering women in history who like transcended gender boundaries, which is great. And like we should find and celebrate those people. But if when we're looking for those people, we find people who very clearly say, actually, I don't identify as a woman, then it doesn't make sense from a historical accuracy standpoint or from a standpoint of looking for diverse stories in history and lots of different kinds of experience. It doesn't make sense to just kind of erase that self-identification. One of the things I guess I'm really passionate about, and I know I've talked to you a bit about this before, is that lots of different groups can find kind of identification and solidarity with the same person. So it's okay for women to feel, solidarity and connection with the story of the public universal friend, just as trans people can. But what I think is different about this case is that this is someone really clearly and explicitly saying, I don't identify as having a gender. And that's inextricable from the kind of their spiritual and religious beliefs. It's not something that's just about gender, as is the case with pretty much everybody's gender. It's also about other things. And in this case, it's about religion. But that doesn't mean that women can't find kind of inspiration in their story, but it does mean, I think, that representing them just as a woman who escaped gender boundaries is really misrepresenting who they actually were.
Yeah, like you said, like in this case, it's so specific. The friend described themselves like very clearly, here's what's going on with me. So this is part of where in last week's episode as well, where I was talking with Bretta LaFleur about Deborah Sampson / Robert Shirtliff, who's a figure who I know because I've heard from listeners, like women who find inspiration in that story of this soldier. And of course you can. And like looking at it through the lens of trans history is not attempting to take that away. It's just saying like, and here's another way you can see the story. And here's a way that other people can maybe find inspiration as well. Because that's an inspiring person. Public universal friend, I don't know if that's an inspiring person, but it's an interesting person. And I think what I'm learning about trans history as I go through these episodes and learning from you and from other scholars is just kind of looking backwards at somebody lived their life in a certain way. And then sometime in the 20th century, somebody came along to be like, well, actually, this is what it is. And here's how it's actually a woman. And here's why that's inspiring. And then in kind of the 21st century, someone comes along to be like, is it that? Like the way that each generation sort of reinterprets the stories. And so I try to, as much as possible, look back at like, who was the person actually? Not how were they reinterpreted. Or people, again, this story it's different in the sense that the public universal friend very clearly said who they were. So for people saying like, here's what I think was actually going on in their head. It's like, we know what was going on in this person's head, actually, because they made their whole life just telling the story of who they were and why they were. But this is the sort of reason why I love having you on the show and having other scholars on the show, because I want to be able to describe this well for listeners who are maybe new to trans history or new to this way of thinking about narratives.
Yeah, sure. And I think, like I was saying, it's really important to say that none of this is about saying that you can't understand this as a really inspiring piece of feminist history. Although, as I say, the extent to which you might want to be inspired by this particular example is, maybe up for debate. But there's, even if we think about it as someone doing things that most people assigned female at birth couldn't do, there's no one saying that you can't find that important. But it's also, I think, equally important, particularly in a climate where trans history is so often erased and where the claim that trans people are new is being used politically in really meaningful and harmful ways. It is also important to say that what is going on here is an example of people being able to understand the concept of a genderless person or a genderless spirit in the 18th century. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, also, and in a Christian religious context.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate being able to, like, the scholarship that exists so I can have episodes like this talking about interesting people from trans history on this podcast. And on the podcast, I do try to focus on weird stories or people who are living sort of audacious, scandalous lives, which is exactly what this is. So I never want anyone to feel like I'm taking away from women's history by talking about trans history. I think it's all one thing. It's just history of just one doesn't have to negate the other, basically.
Absolutely, yeah. It can be women's history and trans history, and it can be history of gender not limiting us and gender not being something that we can't change and mold into what we want it to be. And that's liberating for everyone, right?
And I think this story, too, just in the context of trans history, it's another interesting example of that trans history comprises all kinds of different gender experiences, including that of people who die and are reborn as God incarnate in a genderless form.
Exactly.
Like in the acronym, the LGBTQIA+, this is the plus.
Yeah. There's a lot under that plus, and some of it is resurrection.
Yeah, exactly. The plus contains a lot. And so at the end of most of my episodes, although I forgot to do this last time I had you on the show, I like to score the people who we talk about in a variety of categories, just sort of as a way to wrap things up, but also as a way to sort of just compare people to each other. and a way to, there's certain historical characteristics that are celebrated in traditional, conventional, mainstream patriarchal history. And on my show, I want to celebrate other things to give a really high score to people who may not on other people's scales. And so if you would indulge me. So for Public Universal Friend, we're going to go through these 4 categories, which I have forewarned you about. And the first category is scandaliciousness. In the context of this, it means how scandalous were they to the world in which they lived? Because there's sometimes when you look at the history of, I don't know, let's say like ancient Rome, which we're going to look at later, but that's a world where it's like, oh, did you kill your father and then poison your grandmother and then marry your sister? It's like, okay, that's just kind of what we do. So like to us, that's scandalous, but in their era, it wouldn't be. So we're looking at how scandalous was this person considering their time and place. And Public Universal Friend, I mean, as attested by the angry mobs, I think was seen as pretty scandalous.
Yeah, you don't get stones and brickbats thrown at you. You don't get 30 people showing up at your house with an ox cart if you're not pretty high on the scandaliciousness score, I think.
Yeah. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I'm just thinking, so certainly the reaction that they had. And part of it too is not just did things happen to them that were scandalous, but how much were they actively doing things that people found scandalous? And their whole deal, like the whole, like, I'm going to be a Quaker type person, but I'm also going to be a celebrity, which is so against, like, the Quakers, I think, would be like 10 out of 10. This person is horrific.
Oh, yeah.
And then to the Quakers themselves. So I think it's a pretty high score. And then in society in general, like the gender presentation stuff, I think people are kind of freaked out by that. The people from other denominations who were startled by the, like, does this person think they're Jesus? That is, I'm tempted to say 10 out of 10 for scandaliciousness, honestly.
I was going to go for 9 or 10. Yeah. I mean, like you say, that you don't get much more scandalous than we are scared this person literally thinks they're Jesus in a pretty fundamentalist Christian community.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know. The only thing that would be maybe more scandalous would be like this person says they're Satan, but I don't know. So let's say 9.5. The next category is the scheminess. And in this show, that's a positive. People with a scheme and a plan. How much are they sort of like, they see what's going on and they can kind of roll with the punches and move along with it. And this is interesting to me to think about because the Public Universal Friend, I don't know how much they had a scheme and a plan and how much they were just kind of like, just vibing.
You said vibing earlier, didn't you? I mean, if you take the conspiracy theory route of like all of this is a scheme, be reborn as a genderless person, gain incredible celebrity, be able to demand any gifts you want by saying the friend has need of these things. If you see that as like an actual plan, that's incredibly schemy. I'm not sure it was an actual plan. I think this person was just kind of going with the flow a bit. So I would maybe go lower on that. But if we decide that everything was actually planned, then it will be much higher.
I don't think it was actually planned. My interpretation of this just seems like eventually they did get followers and, a beautiful house and anything from anybody that they wanted. But I think if it had been a real grift scheme, there would have been more like money-making stuff going on. And there wasn't really. Like, it's just kind of the followers came and then that brought with it drama about property taxes and whatever. But I think the friend was just kind of like, here's what I want to do. Be a preacher. So I feel like the scheminess is low, but that's part of what makes it interesting because like they caused so much chaos without really scheming.
Without really meaning to. And I think there was some opportunism and materialism behind it, but there was also like some sincere religious belief that they genuinely had been reborn and had a vision of God and things. So yeah, I'd go maybe like 3 or 4 there, I think.
I'm going to say 4 because I do want to, especially I'm going to go up from a 3 to a 4 because of that part where they republish that other person's book as their own book.
Yes. The plagiarism.
Well, I just thought more people would read it if it had my name on it. Okay. So significance. And this can be, there's the story has a lot of resonances. So there's stuff like in terms of just American history significance, like the first American to found a religious order. But then there's also stuff like significance to trans history, significance to religious history, and where that would be on a scale of 0 to 10. Although I do want to mention, I don't know if this will affect, but I did find out it was not a typo in my thing. The place where the saddle and things are is actually in a place called Penn Yan. That is apparently in Yates County in Pennsylvania. Truly, it looked like a typo, but that is the name of the place.
Who knew?
So it's like to have like a museum exhibit dedicated to you, I think. To be like, this is their saddle, this is their carriage. I'm like, well, that's speaks to some significance.
It's a big deal. And I think they're really important to lots of trans people today. The idea that someone in the 18th century was confidently declaring that they had no gender, that's a big deal. And I think has like a lot of political resonance today as well. So I'd go pretty high there.
I'm happy to go with a 10 for significance because I think everything you said, and I mean, and I'll say it again, but just the fact that they were confidently being like, I am agender, and the followers were like, that's great. And 300 of them were like, we believe that, and let's start a commune with you. Like in 1776, it's like, okay, that many hundreds of years ago, people were cool with it. So like, pay attention.
Yeah, let's do
world
it.
now.
Let's go 10.
I think so. And then the fourth category, which when I started this show and I made this scale, and I can't change the scale because I invented it 4 years ago. I was doing just the stories of like cis women. So it was a straightforward thing to be like, how much does sexism affect their life? But then when I'm getting into stories about not just like trans figures from history, but also sometimes I'm looking at like Black enslaved women, where it's like, well, sexism was kind of one of many things that was affecting this person. But for this, the sexism bonus, this is the reason I invented that category was for somebody who, some, queen from English history who was shut away in a castle because she dared to speak up, and then she, was trapped there for 35 years and died. She would get a 10 out of 10 sexism bonus because that's a person who probably wouldn't get scores in any other category. And I want everyone to get something. But for this story, I don't feel like sexism got in their way at all.
I mean, they kind of sidestepped the whole sexism thing by being like, well, I don't have one. Which means that, despite being assigned female at birth, actually sexism didn't affect them at all. They avoided the fate of their mum dying in childbirth with her 12th child, which is a huge deal. Yeah, I don't think sexism held them back very much at all.
No, I don't think so, which is, astonishing given what was happening to their mom and to the sister who was, excommunicated for having a child out of marriage. But yeah, and there's been other people on the show where it's sexism. There's some people who it kind of work to their advantage, So it's not always, everyone's not going to always get a high score. I'm going to give them a 1 for sexism bonus because I'm sure it affected them somehow because of the era in which they lived. And I don't know if the friend had been assigned male at birth, died, came back and was like, I am a genderless person. The way that they were treated to some extent was because they had lived the first part of their life as a woman. Like a man doing many of these things may not have been as controversial.
Yeah, maybe. Although then they would have probably have experienced misogyny if they'd had to dress in a feminine way to kind of emphasize their genderlessness. But
True.
Equally, they wouldn't have been treated as one of the reasons the Public Universal Friends dress was controversial is like you're trying to ascend the social hierarchy from woman to something better than woman. And that was the whole problem. So yeah, I think 1 is fair.
Yeah, so I'm just going to officially put them here in my scale of people. Public Universal Friend, 24.5 is their score out of 40. And just to give you some context for what that means and who else is in that neighborhood, a name that you probably would know is Catalina de Arauso.
Oh, hey.
The other figure from trans history who has a 23.5. So they're neighbors. Next door neighbors are on the list, just 1 point separating them.
I think they'd get on.
I think they would get on, and I would not want to be in that dinner party. I think they were both big personalities and also quite insufferable. So that's lovely. Thank you so much. So I wanted to just follow up, or just to ask you, episode is coming out during June, which is Pride Month. Is it Pride Month in the UK? I know you have different celebratory months there.
We do, but Pride Month is the same. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Pride Month, it's June in Canada, and in the US. Is there any charity or fundraiser or website or anything you want to especially give a shout out to at this time?
Oh, thank you. I would actually love to shout out the organisation Transactual in the UK, who do really important work combating the incredible misinformation around trans rights, particularly trans healthcare and trans kids at the moment. So if people want to check out their work and consider donating, that would be fantastic.
That's lovely. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And then if people want to keep up with you online, I know you have a website and Instagram. Is there where specifically would people be able to follow you, would you suggest?
So I'm on Instagram at Kit Heyam Writer. I am still on Twitter for my sins. That's at KR Heyam. But Instagram's probably the network that's not going to crash and burn in the next few months. So go with that.
Yeah, that's always when I record things a couple weeks ahead. I'm just like, where are you and what website will still be functioning 2 weeks from now? But thank you so much, Kit. And I do want to mention to the listeners, so the last time Kit was on this podcast, we were talking about Elagabalus, the trans Roman horn dog teenage emperor who was emperor for 5 minutes. And I neglected to get Kit to help me with the scoring. So we are going to record this afterwards. And I'm going to make that recording available on Patreon. And then also I'm going to go back and edit it back into the Elagabalus episode. So if you have 5 more minutes to spare, we'll record that next.
Great, let's do it.
So, because this is our 18th century / Marie Antoinette season, how do you solve a problem like Marie Antoinette? Everyone who we're talking about this series, I'm going to show you how they connect back to Marie Antoinette. And actually, I did have a suggestion from a listener because I am trying to figure what would be some good merch ideas for this series. And their suggestion was the whole 6 degrees of Marie Antoinette. And so now I'm picturing sort of like one of those conspiracy boards, like where all the names are attached by red string, and maybe there's a little portrait of the person, just showing how everyone connects back to Marie Antoinette. Public Universal Friend does as well. So the closest connection I could find. So Public Universal Friend's father's cousin, Stephen Hopkins, was one of the many people who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The Declaration of Independence was also signed by various American founding fathers who would later become friends with the Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette, again, I can't not picture him as Daveed Diggs from Hamilton. Marquis de Lafayette was frenemies, or frankly enemies, with Marie Antoinette. They knew and hated each other. So if we go from Public Universal Friend to their father, to their father's cousin, to the founding fathers, to Lafayette, to Marie Antoinette, that is 5 degrees of separation between these two people, for the record. And again, I do want to just really extra shout out Kit's book, Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. It's described as a groundbreaking global history of gender nonconformity. Kit talks about other people who we've discussed on this podcast, like Njinga, for instance, of Angola. So it's a great book to read, and also to celebrate Pride, I put together a playlist of 27 episodes of Vulgar History, which deal with queer history. And that's people from all of the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. Like we said in this episode, Public Universal Friend is very much plus in terms of that acronym, but we talk about people like Njinga, who is pansexual, and maybe also a part of trans history. Oh, for sure, a part of trans history. We also have episodes about people like Christina of Sweden, who was potentially intersex, but also certainly a queer history story. Hortense Mancini, who was bisexual. I was just going through all the episodes we've done about different people on this podcast who fall under that umbrella. Empress Sisi I included on this playlist because there's a reading that she could have been demisexual or maybe asexual. So all these, queer history is a huge umbrella. And all the people that we talk about on this podcast are just various stages of just like messy chaos people. And so just celebrating
gay villains, queer and trans weirdos. Anyway, the whole playlist, the link to it is in the show notes. I just put it together on Spotify. 31 hours of Vulgar History episodes, including some author interviews, just celebrating queer history. I'm happy that of the however many episodes I've done of Vulgar History, 27 have had queer themes, and I hope, well, now more do, because this episode, it's Pride Month, and I just want to do that together as my little way of celebrating queer history. So this is the Vulgar History Podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and you can keep up with me in all kinds of various ways. So for starters, we are on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. And then also, if you want to keep up with us, I have a Substack, which is vulgarhistory.substack.com. And that's, if you want to subscribe there, I have a weekly newsletter. At the moment, the newsletter is talking about Tudor history. So it's not exactly the same stuff we're talking about on the podcast, but so I call it, it's like a sister. It's like a cousin of this podcast. It's like a father's cousin who signed the Declaration of Independence. Some connection, but it's not exactly the same thing. You can also support the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. So I'm doing more on Patreon. It's because Instagram is got some weird things happening with the algorithm. It's doing some weird stuff with AI. I'm still posting Instagram as well, but I know not everyone is on there and not everyone loves it. So I'm sharing more content on Patreon, which you can join for free. And you'll just get like a little notification whenever I post something new there, like a picture or a question or a poll. So everyone's welcome to become a free member of the Patreon. Or if you want to become a paid member of the Patreon, you get some goodies, like not literal physical goodies, but if you pledge at least $1 or more a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History. And if you pledge $5 or more a month, you get access to bonus episodes. So those are things like Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with unofficial co-hosts Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. Also things like the after show. For instance, the recording that Kit and I did after this, where we scored Elagabalus, that's there on the after show. Anyway, there's also episodes of So This Asshole, where I talk about gross men from history. That's what's happening on Patreon. That's a place where I'm putting more content. So if you want to join me there, either as a free or paid member, we have a nice time. There's also chats there. So for all the paid members, there's a weekly episode chat where you can talk about it. For people at the $5 or more level, there's the super secret salon we have on Discord, where we just kind of like, whatever, we're showing pictures of our pets. We're just chatting. I'm letting you know. There's like a spoilers thread where I'm kind of giving hints about what I'm up to. Because, I'm writing a book and I'm sharing things there about that. And we also have our beloved brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So Common Era Jewelry, I want to say, first of all, it's a small business. It's a woman-owned business. And they make beautiful jewelry pieces and also things like scrunchies and hair bows inspired by women from classical mythology as well as from history. And so in terms of Pride Month, there is a Sappho themed necklace for all my sapphics. There's also Hatshepsut, who is another person we've done an episode about. That's included on my Pride podcast playlist because Hatshepsut is a part of trans history, because trans history is the history of people and gender expressions, not specifically just about people who themselves are trans people, which Hatshepsut lived so long ago. Who's to say? Anyway, Hatshepsut, an iconic person. And you can get a necklace with Hatshepsut on it from Common Era Jewelry, as well as Sappho, other iconic women, Boudica, Cleopatra, Hecate, Agrippina. There's also Anne Boleyn, Aphrodite, Medusa. Anyway, I love their pieces. They're my brand partner because I love them, and legitimately I have like 3 of the necklaces. Anyway, if you want to get a discount, you can go to commonera.com/vulgar, or when you're checking out, use vulgar at checkout to get 15% off whatever you're ordering from Common Era Jewelry. If you want to get some Vulgar History merch, you can get that at vulgarhistory.com/store. In terms of Pride Month, I'm just thinking about which of the queer figures we have on merchandise. Hortense Mancini. We have a beautiful design with her. We also have a design featuring the Chevalier d'Eon, the iconic trans woman from French history. And anyway, you can just take a look at the store. vulgarhistory.com/store. That takes you to our TeePublic store, and that's got good shipping for Americans. If you're outside the US, I recommend using the Redbubble shop, which is at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Both places have all the same stuff: t-shirts, pins, stickers, like represent vulgar history with increasingly niche inside jokes that no one else will understand. But imagine if you were out there and you had your vulgar history sticker on your phone case or whatever, and somebody sees your sticker that has, like, "Where is your God now, John Knox?" You could make a little friend, someone else from the Tits Out Brigade, which is what our listeners are called. You can get in touch with me. We have a form at vulgarhistory.com where you can just send me your message, your thoughts, your suggestions of people you want us to talk about on the podcast, your thoughts about Public Universal Friend. Have you been to the museum where you can see Public Universal Friend's saddle and carriage and other things? Let me know, because I would love to see those things. And next week, we're going to be sticking with American history a bit longer. It's going to be me doing a solo episode, and I'm going to be talking about a woman from American history who, when I did a survey a bit ago of American listeners, of just people who I was thinking about doing episodes about, this is the second best known woman from American history. Something like 80% of the people who did this survey had heard of this woman. It's a fairly famous woman from American history, from 18th century American history. Marquis de Lafayette is going to be involved again. The Marquis de Lafayette is in so many stories. I feel like I'm inevitably going to need to do an episode about him, because I think he was kind of a chaos person as well. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Happy Pride Month. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.